and the early 1990s. That's the latest BBC News.
That was David Austin. I'm Jackie Leonard, and you're listening to the Newsroom from the BBC World Service. And we'll begin this programme with the disturbing report on the violence in Iraq. The United Nations says the number of those killed there is likely to be much higher than the 18,800 civilians it's reported. It documents the deaths between January 2014 and October 2015. Francesco Motta is director of the UN Human Rights Office in Iraq.
The nature of the conflict has included some gross systematic human rights violations perpetrated particularly by the so-called Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. Atrocities include ethnic cleansing, murder, kidnapping, rape, sexual violence, wanton destruction of religious and cultural property, destruction of essential infrastructure, and the enslavement, sexual enslavement of thousands of members of minority communities.
The report says more than 3 million people have been displaced, including 1 million children. This Iraqi man, now in a camp outside Fallujah, lost 2 daughters fleeing Ramadi in a bomb blast. Prior to their escape, one of his sons also suffered at the hands of the Islamic State group.
They took my son and held him for a year, accusing him of belonging to the police or being an army spy. Then they came and said, "We've killed him, and don't even ask about him or you'll be in trouble." Life was terrible. The children were living in fear. The dogs were living better than us.
So how common a picture is this in Iraq? We heard from Mohammed Yahya, who's editor in BBC Arabic.
Now, the period of this report covers really the period of the rise and the surge of the Islamic State. In January, the Islamic State started by taking over parts in the Anbar province, the Ramadi, and then in June, between June and September, came their big push where they captured almost a third of the area of Iraq, the second largest city of Mosul, down to Tikrit. They committed horrific massacres. In one incident in a camp called Camp Spiker, where they massacred around 1,500 police or army cadets there who were unarmed. The tide began to turn on them in 2015 when the city of Tikrit was regained, and in December of last year the city of Ramadi was regained. But Baghdad has been particularly volatile because a lot of suicide attacks and bombings happened in the capital. The areas that have been relatively calm was the southeastern part, which is predominantly Shia, and the Kurdish areas. But nowhere in Iraq is safe, but these were relatively safer.
You say relatively calm. I mean, we hear about these almost unimaginable numbers and these terrible events that have been taking place. In the relatively calm areas, is a kind of normality going on? Are people going to work? Are children going to school? Is business being done?
Yes, and even in Baghdad, the business life goes on. People are going to school and universities and going to their work. Of course, the picture is completely different in the areas that are under control of the Islamic State group and in areas that are literally front lines where fighting is going on.
And are minority communities in particular vulnerable?
Yes, it started with the evicting of almost all the Christians who were living in Mosul. And then we saw the targeting of the Yazidis in Sinjar. First, they captured the town and they pushed almost tens of thousands of people up a mountain. They were under threat of being massacred if it wasn't for the intervention of the Western Coalition Air Force, which managed to evacuate them.
You talk about millions being displaced. Where are they all going?
Well, they've moved to other safer parts of Iraq, and indeed we have seen a lot of Iraqis join the flood of refugees who have been moving on to Turkey and then onto Europe.
That was Mohammed Yahya from BBC Arabic. Well, the issue of migration is proving troublesome for politicians on both sides of the Atlantic. The US Supreme Court has agreed to consider whether President Obama has the authority to protect migrants from deportation. The president of the European Council, Donald Tusk, has warned that the European Union is running out of time to solve its own migrant crisis. And 40 MPs from Angela Merkel's governing coalition in Germany have written to her demanding that she changes what they call her open door poor policy on the issue. But how much is this challenge a consequence of the attacks on hundreds of women in Cologne on New Year's Eve, reportedly committed mainly by migrants and asylum seekers? Our Berlin correspondent Jenny Hill says the issue of how best to accommodate migrants is extremely complex.
There's no doubt, first of all, of course, that what happened in Cologne has intensified the public debate. It's certainly really inflamed it. But, that debate was already happening. And no wonder, more than 1 million people came into Germany last year seeking asylum. Already this year, now these figures aren't official, but it's been reported here, something like 50,000 people have arrived in the first 2 weeks of this year. So there is huge concern across Germany at how it's going to cope logistically. There's a lot of talk about how, for example, people here are going to make sure that the new immigrants are taught German, for example. How on earth are you going to integrate these people? And what happened in Cologne, many see as a real symptom of that lack of integration, of a real evidence, if you like, for some that Mrs. Merkel's policy has failed and it's not really been thought through. But a lot of these critics, for example, her transport minister today has come out and said Mrs. Merkel needs to prepare to close the border. A lot of these critics, including that transport minister, are saying what we really need is a European-wide solution. But without that, we've really got to do something. Germany's going to have to act alone. And of course, Germany's not the only European country saying that. Look, for example, at Sweden and Denmark in the last couple of weeks acting by themselves, trying to tighten and, in effect, close borders. So there is a lot of concern here. It's not all aimed at Mrs. Merkel, but my goodness, she really is under a lot of pressure at the moment. At the same time, I think a lot of people here do also say, well, what else would another leader have done? These people would still have come into Europe, they argue, and we would still have had to deal with that problem.
That was Jenny Hill in Berlin. There have been angry demonstrations in a number of major Indian cities against the death of a PhD student in Hyderabad, who they say was driven to suicide by caste discrimination. Rohit Vemula, who belongs to a low caste, hanged himself, leaving behind a suicide note which said his birth had been a fatal accident. The row has now escalated into a political one, as our South Asia editor Charles Haviland reports.
The protests have spread from Hyderabad, where Rohit Vemula was found hanged with an apparent suicide note, to Delhi, Mumbai and Pune. There have also been political demonstrations in Chennai and in Gujarat and Punjab states. Many protesters called Mr. Vemula's death institutional murder, or rallied for the rights of Dalits, the low-caste social group to which the research student belonged. He and 4 other Dalit students had been suspended by the University of Hyderabad after a row in which some people accused them of assaulting a student affiliated to India's governing party, the BJP. The university at first absolved them of guilt, only excluding them after a BJP minister demanded they be disciplined for what he called anti-national activities. Acting on a complaint from Dalit students, the police have now registered a case against the minister and the university vice-chancellor. The opposition, like the demonstrating students, has demanded that both of them resign. But the Minister of Social Justice, Tawar Chand Gehlot, himself a Dalit, denied any complicity by the governing party, which is sometimes accused of being anti-minority.
BJP ministers have nothing to do with the student suicide. The protesters are only using the ministers' names for the sake of protest. Indeed, the Human Resources Minister has instituted an inquiry into the incident.
Rohit Vemula's suicide note said nobody else had instigated his death, but he appeared to bemoan his caste situation, calling his own birth a fatal accident, and saying the value of a man had been reduced to his immediate identity.
That was our South Asia editor Charles Haviland. You're listening to the BBC World Service, still to come on the Newsroom.
Had there been what I call a kind of extremist radicalisation, inoculation, perhaps I would never have joined them and wasted so many years of my youth.
Reaction to the British government initiative to try and stop youngsters from becoming radicalised. We'll have more on that a little later. Now, though, David has the headlines.
European politicians are under mounting pressure to resolve the migration crisis that's seen more than 1 million people enter the EU over the past year. The US Supreme Court has agreed to consider whether President Obama has the right to protect migrants from deportation after his plans were blocked by legal challenges. And a United Nations report on Iraq has detailed shocking levels of violence against civilians, including what it says could be acts of genocide by the Islamic State group.
Now, as we were reporting this time yesterday, the start of the Australian Open tennis tournament has been overshadowed by a report from the BBC and BuzzFeed News, accusing tennis authorities of failing to crack down on players suspected of throwing matches. Novak Djokovic revealed that he had been offered $200,000 to lose a game early in his career. Our colleagues at World Have Your Say have been speaking to a former professional tennis player, now a coach, who says that match fixing was rife when he was playing. Frank, not his real name, retired from the professional circuit last year. Chloe Tilley asked him if he had seen evidence of corruption.
Yes, many times. Well, I see first meetings, money transactions, fixing problems during the match result where somebody has to get a break and he didn't, so he need to call the trainer, make time to fix that online and see what the player has to do, either retire or if they can do another bet where they recover the money, or because when some player retire, the bet got cancelled.
You say you've seen meetings and money changing hands. Just explain the details of that.
This is cash. There's not wired bank to a bank. So there's people, there are three big groups, that controlling bettings in tennis. Each group have many, guys who go to talk to players. They have many guys inside the circuit, and also they have many accounts because you will see there's never a big bet. Here and there is a big bet, but it's by a lucky fan that bet. But these people, they have 50, 60 accounts where they place small money that at the end, is a huge money, It's like a secret in the tour that everybody knows, but we don't talk about it. We just see it and keep walking,
And have you ever reported this to the tennis authorities?
Me?
Yes.
No, I haven't reported because they know who is exactly doing it. If they want to stop it, they stop it today. They know exactly who is doing it and how. I mean, it's super easy. They just don't want to do it.
That was a retired tennis professional talking to Chloe Tilley. And just to be clear, the people ruling tennis have rejected suggestions that they haven't done enough to tackle match fixing. And they said they're confident of tackling corruption in their sport. The Chinese President Xi Jinping has been meeting the King of Saudi Arabia at the beginning of a 5-day tour of the Middle East, which will also include stops in Iran and Egypt. It's his first visit to the region since becoming president. Our Asia-Pacific editor, Michael Bristow, is here in the Newsroom studio. So tell us a bit more about China's relationship with Saudi Arabia and the other countries on this tour.
Well, essentially, it's economic, and that economic relationship is based on oil. Saudi Arabia is China's biggest oil supplier, but Iran supplies a lot of oil, other countries in the Middle East too. It goes further, though, the economic relationship. Middle Eastern countries, just like every country across the world, is awash with Chinese manufactured goods. And also Chinese firms are very heavily involved in infrastructure projects in the Middle East. It's building a high-speed railway from Mecca to Medina, and it's also helping to build a metro in Tehran. So President Xi Jinping will want to enhance and sign more of these kind of deals on this tour.
And given that they have so many interests in the region, is it in China's interests then to help try and sort out some of the problems with security and stability in the region?
It probably is, but China in the past and traditionally has tried to avoid doing that, not interfering in other people's internal affairs, partly because it doesn't want other countries to interfere in what's going on inside China. But of course, it's getting drawn more into those affairs. If you've got millions of barrels of oil streaming through the seas of Arabia into towards China, you've got to protect that somehow. And so obviously Xi Jinping is probably going to be pushed towards getting more involved in disputes there and saying the right things, but he'll try to resist that as much as possible.
Mickey, thank you. That was Michael Bristow, our Asia-Pacific editor. Now, it's a familiar gripe of shoppers here in the UK that a lot of identical stuff seems to be much cheaper in the United States. But a new report by the Times newspaper has found cause for complaint closer to home. In Britain, women are paying more for goods than men are. Here's some of what it says.
The cost of clothes, beauty products and toys for women and girls is higher than equivalent items marketed at men and boys, according to an analysis of hundreds of products. The sexist prices can be found at many of Britain's biggest retailers, including Tesco, Boots and Amazon. In one case, Tesco charges double the price for 10 disposable razors simply because they are pink.
Well, Jemima Olhafsky is from the women's rights campaign group, the Fawcett Society, and she joins us now. Thanks for talking to us, Jemima. Now, as someone who tends to avoid pink anyway, does this mean that we can save money simply by avoiding pink?
Well, in some cases, and I think this is an issue that a lot of women have probably suspected things like this have been going on or experienced specific examples. But actually, what's really shocking about this research is the breadth and range of products that are included and the amounts of money. And in some cases, it's possible to avoid it if you just avoid pink. But in some cases, it's about buying a man or a woman's perfume or men and women's jeans. And then it's not so easy to make the switch.
The companies involved, some of them have said, we work hard to offer clear, fair and transparent pricing. That was from Tesco. The number of products for females have additional design and performance features. Another one says that it's about costs based on factors including formulation, ingredients and market comparison. Is that fair enough? Are they spending more on the female versions?
I think really this is just a sexist surcharge. Women are paying extra for the privilege of a product that's apparently designed for them. And the thing that's particularly unfair is that women are being ripped off twice here. So the first time as a result of the pay gap. So in the UK, the average pay gap for a woman working full time is 13.9%. And then when she has earned that money, she finds it doesn't go as far because buying the same things costs her more than it would cost a man. And I just don't buy the idea that these have added modifications. In some cases, there's clearly very little or no difference. But where there are differences, because men and women might have different needs or different preferences, I think it's really revealing that many of these companies are still beginning with the male product as the default and then modifying it or alter it in order to meet women's needs. Women make up over half of the population. So I think really it's time for designers, retailers to start creating products with them in mind. And if modifications really are necessary, making those for both products and splitting the cost fairly.
Thank you for that, Jemima. That was Jemima Olhafsky from the women's rights campaign group, the Fawcett Society. Now, David has some of the other stories from our news desk.
Police in Israel are investigating allegations that travel firms organising school visits to the Nazi death camp at Auschwitz have been involved in price fixing. 9 Israeli travel company executives have been arrested on suspicion of inflating prices. Arrest warrants have been filed in the United Arab Emirates for 2 men who put on a film on the internet showing them dancing in military uniforms. Prosecutors described the pair as making outrageous physical movements that disrespected both the uniform and national service. And the president of Zambia has revoked Clifford Dimba as ambassador against gender violence after he was accused of assaulting a woman. Mr. Dimba was originally sentenced in 2014 to 18 years in prison for a previous crime of raping a teenager, but he was pardoned by President Lungu and given the ambassadorial role. The United Nations had described that appointment as outrageous.
The British government has unveiled its latest plan to combat radicalisation in schools. There are a number of initiatives, including a website called Educate Against Hate. The Education Secretary, Nicky Morgan, outlined the sort of behaviour they want to stamp out.
It's things like obviously showing a particular interest in what's happening overseas and also wanting to shut down debate or wanting perhaps to pursue the path of segregation, which is not something that we want to see in this country.
So how likely then is the latest move to work? I've been hearing the story of Adam Dean from London.
In my late teens, I developed a keen interest in my faith, which is Islam. I wanted to learn more about it. On this journey, I felt I wasn't getting the answers that I wanted from the elders within the community and from my local mosque. So I looked elsewhere. I bumped into someone who was part of an extremist organisation. He intrigued me and he spoke about Islam in a sort of intellectualised form. And that had an appeal. From that moment onwards, I had frequent meetings. And then what happened subsequently is I became more and more sympathetic to their ideas and then eventually joined the organisation.
And what was it that eventually changed your mind?
I became disillusioned, and I think it was a process of understanding that there's a lot more to the world than what this group was telling me. I had a mentor who was sort of a philosophy lecturer, and he kind of took me under his wing and sort of pulled me aside and said, look, there's more to this than what you're being taught. He taught me sort of critical thinking skills, and it allowed me to assess what I'd been taught. And that actually what it turned out to be was completely baseless. So I think what was the most important factor was the ability to decipher what was correct, what was dogmatic, what was incorrect for myself. And almost by osmosis, I broke away from the organisation.
Now, you came to that realisation on your own and with the help of your teacher. But what do you think of the various ways in which the British government is trying to help counter radicalisation among the young?
I think it's actually a good move. Had there been what I call kind of extremist radicalisation inoculation, perhaps I would never have joined the organisation, which is now a banned organisation known as Al-Muhajirun.
What do you think are the key points that would have helped you in the first place when you were a teenager?
When I was growing up, I didn't really have anyone that I could have respected that actually spoke the same language as myself in a way that I could relate to. Had I had ideas that stopped me becoming extreme, and also someone that I respected that could explain my faith to me in a tolerant and encompassing way, I think that would have helped a lot.
That was Adam Dean, who now works for the Quilliam Foundation here in London. Calls for a boycott of next month's Oscars are continuing because of a significant disquiet that this year's Academy Awards nominees show too little racial diversity. The director Spike Lee and the actress Jada Pinkett Smith have both said they won't be attending this year's ceremony. More from our arts correspondent, Vincent Dowd.
It's non-violent protest. We let people know that it's okay to say what you want to say.
The film Straight Outta Compton is about the late 80s hip-hop act NWA. Audiences liked it, and at next month's Oscars, it's up for Best Original Screenplay. But no one in the black cast is nominated for an Academy Award. Last year, all the nominees in performance categories were white. Some had hoped this year's announcements might reveal greater diversity.
For performance by an actor in a leading role, the nominees are Bryan Cranston in Trumbo, Matt Damon in The Martian.
But it didn't happen. Now, Cheryl Boone Isaacs, the African-American head of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, the body which runs the Oscars, has said dramatic steps need to be taken to review our membership recruitment to bring about much-needed diversity. Jada Pinkett Smith, married to actor Will Smith, has already said she'll boycott this year's ceremony in protest at the shortlists.
Maybe it is time that we pull back our resources and we put them back into our communities, into our programs, and we make programs for ourselves that acknowledge us in ways that we see fit.
The Academy does not want this debate to dominate the lead-up to the Oscars in February. Currently, its membership is about 94% white, overwhelmingly male, and there are frequent complaints it's also too old. It's not clear what innovations AMPAS is considering, but in her statement, Cheryl Boone Isaacs says this is a difficult but important conversation, and it's time for big changes.
That was our arts correspondent, Vincent Dowd. More, of course, on that story on the arts pages of our website. Before we go, a reminder of today's main world news. European politicians are under mounting pressure to resolve the migration crisis that has seen more than 1 million people enter the EU over the past year. Stay with us if you can. David will have a news summary for you in just a moment. But for now, from me, Jackie Leonard, and the rest of the team here in London, thank you very much for listening.
And the Newsroom will be back at 19 hours GMT. Now let's have a look at the rest of the day here on the BBC World Service. And in an hour, the second part of our series, The Truth About Diabetes, reports from Tonga.
90% of people are overweight or obese. Diabetes is killing the people and costing the poor island nation dear.
At 20 GMT, The Inquiry.
What's China doing to clear the air? Smog is not just a massive health problem in China. It's a big political one, too. We'll be talking to a man who's written China's laws about the pressures policymakers are now under.
That's followed by Click.
When disaster strikes, social media and SMS technology are effectively useless unless we account for cultural factors too. So say researchers who have studied the relief effort following Typhoon Haiyan in 2013.
And with NewsHour at 21 GMT, those are some of today's highlights here on the BBC World Service. Do stay with us. World Business Report is next.
Coming up in World Business Report, half an hour of voices from around the world explaining what you need to know about the world of work and money. We head to China, where economic growth is now the slowest it's been for 25 years. We'll be asking whether this signifies a meltdown or is simply a natural rebalancing. And it brought long-lost friends, family and star-crossed lovers together. But after 15 years, Britain's first social media site, Friends Reunited, has closed down. We talked to one of its founders. First, the world news.
BBC News with David Austin. There's growing pressure on European politicians to resolve the migration crisis. Arrivals in Greece from Turkey so far this month are more than 20 times higher than last year. The aid agency MSF has warned that the measures taken so far have had catastrophic results. The President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, has warned that the EU has no more than 2 months to get the crisis under control. The Supreme Court in the United States has agreed to review President Barack Obama's initiative in allowing some 5 million illegal migrants to remain in the country and work without fear of deportation. The president took the unilateral executive action in 2014 to bypass Congress. It was then blocked by the lower courts. The United Nations has catalogued what it called staggering and obscene levels of violence against Iraqi civilians over the past 2 years. It's reported more than 18,000 deaths, including acts that may amount to genocide. The French Prime Minister Manuel Valls says 6 Islamist militants took part in the gun attack on a cafe and hotel in Burkina Faso on Friday, which is now known to have killed 30 people. Mr. Valls said 3 of the gunmen were killed, while the other 3 are still on the run. 2 prominent jailed Turkish journalists say their arrest was meant as a warning to the rest of the nation's media. The Cumhuriyet newspaper's editor-in-chief, Can Dündar, and a colleague, Erdem Gül, face espionage allegations. They were charged after publishing a report alleging that the Turkish intelligence agency was shipping arms to Islamist militants in Syria. The German authorities say they're hunting for 3 members of the disbanded Red Army faction, who they believe carried out